very first note, there was darkness so deep it could almost be touched. There was unending silence that tasted like smoke. Then came along the 4 goddesses, 4 sisters, who took pity upon this world of shadows and decided to bring light to it. The first sister, the goddess of fate, was the most obstinate of her siblings. She would always keep working until she obtained what she wanted. She created a blue sun that shone bright but cold. The second and third sisters were twins, the goddess of life and the goddess of death. The goddess of life was beyond beautiful and quite daring, always doing whatever she wanted. She created a red sun which was bright and hot and that nobody could ignore. The goddess of death was more discreet than her sisters, but she was very witty and cunning. She created a green sun that wasn't very bright, nor was it hot or cold. They placed the suns at equal distances from each other in a perfect triangle. And the younger sister, the goddess of creation, was always curious, always seeking to know what could be and what would happen. She was pregnant and gave birth to 7 deities. She then created a moon for each of them, to float freely between the suns her sisters created. The red moon for the goddess of envy and passion, the yellow moon for the god of dreams and despair, the green moon for the god of suffering and bravery, the cyan moon for the god of hope and fear, the blue moon for the god of fertility and laziness, the magenta moon for the goddess of wrath and love, and the white moon for the goddess of stability and indifference. Once the world was full of light, the goddesses thought it would be a waste to have no one live in it. So the goddess of creation made a planet that she called Omneiris. She created continents and seas and wind and rain and storms and clouds and snow. She made grass grow and flowers bloom and seeds sprout and trees reach for the skies. And when she was satisfied with the scenery, she created animals. She made foxes with great antlers and cats with pure white wings and whales with fins carrying them through the clouds and dragons with a breath of fire and wings so big they hid the sands when they were spread, and horses with manes as white as snow and hooves like mother of pearl. She begged the goddess of life to bestow life to her creations that were so far nothing more than puppets. Her sister accepted, but the goddess of death, her dark counterpart, warned the goddess of creation that anything that was given life would eventually die. The young goddess accepted, and Omneiris came to life. After that, there wasn't only light, there was sound and movement and sense and tastes. The goddesses then decided to give life to creatures more similar to them. The goddess of creation created elves, elegant creatures with endless grace and great seriousness. And then she created fairies, who were wild and free and were not confined to any form. She gave the elves beautiful and melodious voices that would grant them the power to understand and interact with nature, and she told them to protect Omneiris. And she gave the fairies some of her creation magic, telling them to fill the world with wonders. The goddess of creation was young and innocent, and she became so attached to her creations that she went to beg the goddess of death to spare them. She answered that if there was no death, there could be no life. The fairies, with their gift of creation, could never give life to another being, be it fairy or otherwise. Seeing the tears in her sister's eyes, the goddess of death continued, saying that the elves were tasked with guarding the world and would thus be allowed to reproduce, but with great difficulty and very rarely. In order to do that, elves couldn't truly be immortal. They would not age beyond adulthood, but they could still fall from injuries and some very dire diseases. And fairies would remain almost untouchable, but gentleless and childless. And so it was. The goddess of creation's children brought feelings and nuance to their mother's creations, and soon Omneiris felt complete, and the deities and the goddesses sat back to observe their work. Elves, as promised, worked alongside nature to protect Omneiris and all its denizens. On the other hand, fairies were really curious beings, even more so than the goddess who created them. Morbidly curious. So much so that they had no qualms about torturing and killing other beings, just to see what would happen. When the elves reprimanded them, the fairies used clay to make puppets quite similar to the elves, but with rounded ears and fuller figures, heavier and bulkier. They called them humans. Those puppets were weak and utterly exploited by the fairies. They were hunted, eaten, cut in little pieces. And the elves did nothing, as they did not consider the humans to be a part of Omneiris. Eventually, fairies stopped trying to provoke the elves and simply played as much as they wanted with the humans, knowing there would be no consequences. They merged them with animals to create hybrids and mutations. They gave them sap instead of blood to turn them into plant people. On the side, they also created toxic and poisonous plants and creatures that they tested on humans. Upon seeing the fairies' behavior, the goddesses agreed that something needed to be done. The goddess of fate told her sisters that the humans and the other folks needed free will and the possibility to fight back. The goddesses of life and death thus gave life and death to the fairies' puppets, and humans found their freedom. But the fairies, with their creation magic, could create monsters and unstoppable weapons and started destroying the world in protest. When they saw that, the four goddesses came together once more, and the goddess of fate convinced her sisters to create one more immortal species, the daemons. They would not be gifted with creation magic, but they would have enough power to counter it and to stop the fairies. And like fairies, they would not be able to reproduce. Since the elves had failed in their mission to protect everyone, daemons would be the ones guarding the weak and defenseless and bring balance to Omneiris. And thus daemons were created. They were beings of shadows and illusions, who were forbidden to listen to the lesser deities, and they battled against the fairies for what seemed an endless melody. Many lives were lost. The goddess of death put a star in the sky for every immortal life extinguished too soon, and stars and constellations started appearing everywhere, telling the story of the fallen, daemons, elves, and fairies. Many humans and animal folks and plant folks were also killed and found a place in the afterworld. A great storm started raging on Omneiris halfway through the Great Wars, flooding the plains, destroying everything, and still the battles went on. Eventually, daemons realized that fairies would never listen to reason. They had no choice but to exile the fairies to the southernmost continent, a frozen desert. To escape this, some fairies managed to make their way into elvish bodies and possess them, but they lost their creation magic in the process. The possessed elves turned into fae, half elf, half fairy. Other fairies were not that lucky and had no choice but to take possession of human bodies. Only women survived and turned into witches, gifted with magic but doomed to live only twice as long as humans. But many fairies were left to deal with the punishment the daemons bestowed on them. A great barrier was built, at the cost of the lives of many daemons. But some fairies were still hidden everywhere on Omneiris, so daemons had to chase them down one by one before confining them wherever they could, in forests, in caves, in lakes. And finally fairies stopped being a threat to Omneiris, and the rain stopped. It had formed great lakes and rivers and ponds. The fairies used the lakes on their continent to create mirrors that would show them what was happening in the world, and they decided to satiate their endless curiosity that way. And the daemons, having accomplished their mission, exiled themselves to a group of islands where, like the fairies, they are watching the events of the world, waiting to be needed again. The goddesses, relieved, reunited once more to discuss how they could prevent such a disaster from happening again. It was then decided that the goddess of life would weave threads of life tied to every living being on the planet. The goddess of death would be tasked with cutting the threads of those who have lived long enough and welcome their souls in her afterworld. The goddess of fate would write a great symphony, where everyone would have a part to play, to interpret. And the goddess of creation would inspire the beings of Omneiris, so the world would keep on moving and improving, little by little.